Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. They thought I was too fragile for the world a woman meant only to water plants and guard empty rooms. But what they forgot is that I had already carried lives through nights of blood and lost lifted bodies heavier than my own and walked decades of roads they will never understand. At 72, they told me to stay behind, to be grateful for silence. That morning when I reached for the envelope waiting in the mailbox, I knew silence would no longer be my role. I stood by the kitchen window, hands resting on the counter, watching the morning light creep across the street in Portland. At 72, the house felt both too quiet and too full of memories. The ticking clock on the wall reminded me of all the mornings I had spent here, first as a wife, then as a mother, and now as a grandmother who was treated more like a piece of furniture than part of the family. David was outside loading suitcases into the back of the black SUV. I could hear the slam of the trunk, the sharp voices of the kids arguing over who got the window seat, and Laura's crisp tone as she reminded everyone to check their passports. They moved with such excitement, laughter spilling out of them like champagne bubbles, while I stood inside the doorway, invisible in my own life. I had hinted weeks earlier, hoping maybe they would ask me to come along. I had said how much I loved history, how I always dreamed of seeing the streets of Florence or the ruins in Athens. Laura never looked at me when I spoke. She just said it would be too hard on me. Too many stairs, too much walking, too long a flight for someone my age. I swallowed the sting in silence. This morning I asked once more, gently, almost pleading without realizing it. David avoided my eyes, fumbling with his phone. Laura finally turned lips painted into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mom, it would be too much for you. It's better if you stay here. Just watch the house for us. Water the plants, double lock the doors. You'll be more comfortable at home." The words hit like a door closing. Too old, too fragile, too much trouble. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I wanted to tell her that I used to work 12-hour shifts in a hospital lifting bodies twice my size, staying awake through nights of emergencies. I wanted to remind her that I had once walked these same streets with a toddler on one hip and groceries in the other. But I said nothing. Silence had been my role for too long. The children ran past me, Amelia with her earbuds dangling and Ethan bouncing a ball in his hands. "Grandma, see you later," Amelia mumbled without looking up. My heart ached for her, for the distance already forming at 16. Ethan gave me a distracted wave. I forced a smile. David finally came in, his face softening when he looked at me. He kissed my cheek quickly. "Mom, we'll send photos. We'll call. You'll be fine." I nodded again. Fine. That word had become my prison. They piled into the SUV, voices overlapping with excitement about beaches in Greece and pasta in Italy. Laura adjusted her sunglasses, started the engine, and they drove off, tires crunching against the driveway. I stood on the porch, waving mechanically until the car disappeared down the street. The echo of their laughter hung in the air long after they were gone. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on me until my chest ached. I walked back inside, every room reminding me of my husband Paul, who had been gone for over 20 years. His photograph on the mantel showed him young, smiling, still full of life. He would not have let this happen, I thought. He would have made sure I was included. I turned toward the kitchen table, ready to make tea and bury the ache in routine. That was when I noticed the edge of a white envelope sticking out of the mailbox by the door. Curious, I stepped outside, opened the box, and pulled it out. The thick paper was stamped with the name of a travel agency. I froze. My fingers shook as I carried it back inside, slid a nail under the flap, and pulled out the contents. 4 plain tickets slipped onto the table, each neatly printed with their names. David Hayes, Jr., age 45, Laura Hayes, age 42, Amelia Hayes, age 16, Ethan Hayes, age 12, departure 3 days from now, destination Athens, return flight 2 weeks later. My name was nowhere on them. Of course it wasn't. They had not even considered me enough to hide the proof. I stared at the tickets until my eyes blurred, my breath caught in my throat. They had trusted me to water their plants, to guard their furniture, to make sure the house stayed safe, but not to walk beside them on streets older than our country. I picked up the tickets again, the paper smooth and cold against my palm. My chest burned with a mixture of grief and something sharper, something I had not felt in years. Anger. For a moment, I thought of tearing them into pieces right there on the kitchen table. Instead, I laid them down gently and sat back in the chair, my hands trembling. The laughter of the children still echoed in my ears. Laura's voice still cut through my memory. David's soft avoidance still pressed against my heart. Too old. Stay home. Watch the house. I poured myself a cup of tea, staring at the tickets as if they were a challenge. Steam curled upward, blurring the edges of the paper, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint stir of something I had thought was gone. A choice. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the weight of the silence settle. Outside the neighborhood was still the wind moving through the leaves. Inside the tickets waited on the table, their presence humming like a secret only I had discovered. I did not move right away. I just sat there, the teacup warm in my hands, staring at the names printed on the slips of paper and the empty space where mine should have been. And for the first time in decades, I felt the beginnings of a question I could not yet answer. What if I did not stay behind this time? I carried the tickets back to the table and laid them flat, staring at the neat rows of letters, as if they might rearrange themselves into something that included me. The silence of the house pressed in on me, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. My hands trembled as I traced each name, each destination, each reminder that I had been excluded from their lives. The kettle whistled faintly from the stove, though I could not remember putting water on to boil. I moved on instinct, lifting it, pouring hot water over the tea bag in my old chipped mug. Steam rose, curling around my face, dampening my cheeks, where tears had already made their way down. I carried the mug to the living room and sat heavily in the armchair by the mantel. Paul's photo stared back at me, his smile caught forever at 54, the year before the cancer took him. I whispered into the quiet, as if he might still be there. You would have never let them leave me behind, Paul. You would have fought for me. I sipped my tea, bitter from oversteeping, and felt the hollow ache of decades of giving and never being asked what I wanted. I thought about the years I had spent on my feet in the hospital, nights of rushing between patients, carrying trays of medication, lifting bodies heavier than my own. The times I had worked double shifts so David could go to college, so Laura and the kids never had to worry about bills. I had poured myself out, and in return, I was given a list of plants to water and locks to double-check. My eyes dropped again to the tickets spread out on the coffee table. The logo of the travel agency mocked me with its cheerful blue lettering. I reached for the phone before I could change my mind. My hands moved as if guided by something deeper than thought. I found the agency's number on the envelope, dialed, and pressed the phone tight against my ear. A woman's voice answered, polite and efficient. "Thank you for calling Pacific Horizons Travel. How may I help you?" My throat was dry, but my words came steady. I need to cancel 4 tickets under the name Hayes. She asked for confirmation numbers, dates the credit card used. I read them from the slips of paper, careful not to let my voice waver. She typed quickly on her end. Are you sure you want to cancel all 4, ma'am? I paused only long enough to swallow. Yes. All 4. The silence on the line was brief but heavy. Very well, ma'am. The tickets are canceled. Here is your cancellation code. She read off a string of numbers and letters. I wrote them on the corner of an old grocery list, pressing hard enough to tear the paper. She asked if I wanted to rebook or use the credit for another trip. My lips curved in something between a smile and a grimace. Not at this time, thank you. I hung up before she could ask more. For a long moment, I sat frozen, phone still in my hand, heart pounding. The house seemed to hum with the enormity of what I had done. I had undone their plans with a single call, stripped away their excitement, their certainty, their laughter at my expense. A flicker of guilt rose, but I smothered it. They had abandoned me first. I stood and walked to the small desk in the corner. Pulling open the drawer, I retrieved my passport, its navy cover worn at the edges. I held it in my lap, stroking the embossed seal, remembering the last time I had used it. Mexico, 1995, a quick trip with Paul before his diagnosis. Nearly 30 years. My chest tightened with both grief and anticipation. I opened my laptop, the screen lighting the dim room. My fingers hovered before I typed in the login for my credit union. The numbers blinked back at me. Savings account $15,432.56. Bonds $5,000. Enough for 1 ticket, maybe 2 if I traveled smart and modest. Enough for me, just me. The realization filled me with a strange exhilaration. I did not need permission. I did not need Laura's approval or David's soft apologies. I had the means and the will. I set the passport beside the tickets, the canceled slips now useless for anyone but me. The 2 objects side by side looked like a before and after, like the choice that would define the rest of my life. I touched Paul's photograph again, whispering into the empty room. Maybe it's time I do something just for myself. The tea had gone cold. I pushed it aside and leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of my decision settle. For the first time in years, my chest lifted with something like defiance, something that tasted almost like freedom. I closed my eyes, imagining the sound of foreign streets, the scent of ocean air, the weight of a suitcase rolling behind me, not for someone else's plans, but for my own. I opened them again and looked around the room at the walls that had held me like a cage. I slipped the passport into my purse, tucked the scrap of paper with the cancellation code inside, and left the canceled tickets spread across the table. They could stay there as a reminder. I was no longer just the woman who watched the house. The clock ticked on steady and certain, as if measuring the new path I had chosen. I sat quietly listening to it until the sound no longer marked emptiness, but possibility. I woke before dawn the next morning, the air in the house sharp with quiet. My decision from the night before had not faded with sleep. If anything, it had hardened. I pulled my small suitcase out from the closet, brushed the dust off its surface, and placed it on the bed. The sound of the zipper sliding open felt like the beginning of something I had almost forgotten I was allowed to have. I folded 2 pairs of slacks, a few blouses, and a cardigan, keeping the colors simple. I tucked in comfortable shoes and my old navy scarf, the one I had worn to Paul's funeral. I held it in my hands for a long moment, remembering how it had once carried the weight of grief. Now, I wanted it to carry something else, a piece of me stepping forward rather than holding back. From the vanity drawer, I found a tube of lipstick that had been sitting untouched for years. The cap clicked open the faint scent of wax and rose, pulling me back to a younger version of myself. I set it carefully in the side pocket of the suitcase. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, I had everything folded neatly. I walked through each room slowly, my fingers grazing the back of the couch, the kitchen counter, the mantel with Paul's photo. My eyes settled on the stack of canceled tickets still on the table. I left them there deliberately. I crossed the street to Carol's house, knocking lightly on her door. She opened it in her robe, her hair messy, eyes squinting against the morning light. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" She asked, her voice low with concern. I took a breath and answered simply, "I need you to keep an eye on my house for a while. Water the plants, check the mail." She frowned, pulling her robe tighter. "For how long?" I hesitated, then smiled. 2 weeks, maybe more." Her eyes widened. "At your age, where are you going?" "Athens," I said quietly. For a second, she simply stared at me. Then her mouth opened shut and opened again. "I never thought you would do something like that." Neither did I admitted, and for the first time in years, I felt the smallest spark of pride. Carol agreed at last, still shaking her head. I thanked her, hugged her lightly, and returned home to collect my bag. The taxi arrived just as the morning traffic began to build. I climbed into the back seat, the suitcase beside me, my heart thudding harder with every mile closer to the airport. The freeway stretched out gray and endless, and I pressed my palms against my knees to steady myself. The terminal was buzzing with travelers' voices in every language, weaving together into a tapestry of anticipation. I had not been here in nearly 3 decades, yet the energy was unchanged. The lines of families, couples with matching backpacks, business travelers in sharp suits. I moved slowly, unsure at first, but each step became steadier as I held my passport like an anchor. At the counter, the clerk scanned my information and handed me the boarding pass. Her cheerful, "Have a wonderful trip," felt like both a kindness and a challenge. I clutched the paper tightly and walked toward security. The process was overwhelming: shoes, off bags on the belt, strangers rushing around me. My knees trembled slightly as I stepped through the scanner, but when the agent waved me through, I let out a breath I had been holding for far too long. I found my gate, sat near the window, and watched the plane that would carry me across the ocean. Its white body gleamed in the light, massive and sure. My hands shook slightly as I smoothed the boarding pass across my lap. When the call came to board, I rose with the others. The air inside the plane smelled of metal and fabric, humming with recycled air and expectation. I found my seat near the wing, lifted my bag into the overhead bin with more strength than I thought I had, and settled in. A young woman slid into the seat beside me, earbuds dangling, her phone glowing with messages. She glanced at me, offered a polite smile, then returned to her screen. I studied her face, the smoothness of skin, not yet lined by decades of sacrifice. She reminded me of Amelia, distracted, but full of life waiting to be lived. She caught me watching and laughed softly. "First time flying this far?" she asked. "First time in 30 years, I answered. "That's amazing," she said, eyes wide. "You'll love Europe. I go every summer for school trips." Her confidence stung and comforted me at once. I smiled, faintly nodding. "I hope so." The engines roared, pressing us back into the seats, the ground slipping away beneath us. My stomach tightened with nerves, but my chest lifted with exhilaration. The city shrank below the rivers, weaving like silver threads, and then there was only sky. Hours stretched long, broken by meals on plastic trays and the restless shifting of passengers. The girl beside me slept most of the way, her head resting against the window, while I sat awake staring at the screen in front of me that traced the plane's slow crawl across the Atlantic. I thought of David and Laura waking to discover their canceled trip. I wondered if they were already furious if they were calling my phone. I did not check. As the plane began its descent, I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. The first glimpse of Athens came into view, sunlit and sprawling, with mountains in the distance and the sea stretching endless and blue. My throat tightened with awe. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt, the cabin filling with the rush of air and the scrape of brakes. My heart leapt. Passengers clapped softly, a ripple of relief moving through the rows. I followed the flow of bodies through customs, the line snaking slow but steady. At last, the officer stamped my passport with a heavy thud, and I felt a thrill of finality. I was here. Outside the terminal, heat pressed down the air, heavy with the scent of dust and exhaust. Taxi drivers called out destinations, their voices unfamiliar but insistent. I clutched the handle of my suitcase, stepped forward, and gave the name of a small hotel I had found online. The ride wound through streets lined with white buildings, balconies draped in laundry scooters, weaving recklessly between cars. My eyes drank in every detail, hungry and alive. At the hotel, a modest place tucked on a narrow street, the clerk handed me a brass key. My room was small, with a single bed and a balcony that overlooked the busy street below. I set my suitcase down, walked to the window, and opened the shutters. The sound of the city rushed in, voices, horns, the faint music of a guitar from somewhere below. I leaned on the railing, the air warm against my face, and whispered to myself. I really did it. The words hung there, almost unbelieving, almost triumphant. For the first time in a very long time, the life before me was mine alone. The next morning I woke with the city already humming below my window. The air drifting in through the open shutters smelled of bread baking and strong coffee. I dressed, simply wrapped my navy scarf loosely around my shoulders, and stepped out into the street with no plan but to walk. The stones under my shoes were uneven and worn the kind of surfaces that had carried footsteps for centuries, and I felt my own feet fitting into grooves carved long before I was born. I followed the flow of people until I found myself in Plaka, the narrow streets lined with whitewashed houses trimmed in blue. Bougainvillea spilled down walls, bright fuchsia against the pale walls, and the air was alive with vendors setting up tables of trinkets and lace. I stopped at a small cafe where the tables sat close together, their metal chairs wobbling slightly against the cobblestones. The waiter, young and smiling, greeted me quickly in English and set down a cup of thick coffee and a small loaf of warm bread sprinkled with sugar. I tore off a piece, the crust crisp in my hands, and dipped it into the bitter liquid. The flavors were sharp, almost shocking, but they woke something in me that had been numb for too long. I sat back listening to the chatter of tourists and the sing-song voices of locals and let the sun warm my shoulders. It struck me then that I was not invisible here. No one looked at me as too old, too fragile, or a burden. I was simply another traveler, anonymous and free. The thought lifted something heavy from my chest. I wandered deeper into the maze of Anaphiotica, where stairways climbed steeply between houses painted in pastel colors, doors open to reveal glimpses of kitchens and tiny courtyards. Cats lounged on windowsills, blinking lazily in the sunlight. I climbed until I was breathless, pausing to rest on a stone step, but instead of feeling weak, I felt alive. My body was working, moving, carrying me where I wanted to go, not where someone else directed. I pulled a postcard from my bag, one I had bought at a stall that morning. The Acropolis shone on the front golden against a blue sky. I found a pen at the bottom of my purse and rested the card against my knee. My hand shook slightly as I wrote the words I had been holding inside. Amelia. I am in Greece. Do not tell anyone. Love, Grandma. I read it over twice, the ink slightly smeared where my hand had brushed it. I pictured her face, the quiet curiosity she carried, the way she looked at me sometimes, with questions she was too shy to ask. She was the only one I trusted with this secret. I slipped the card back into the envelope and resolved to mail it before the end of the day. As the afternoon grew warmer, I stopped in another cafe, this one tucked into the corner of a square shaded by olive trees. I ordered a second coffee lighter this time and listened to the hum of voices around me. I watched couples laugh together, families passing plates, old men arguing cheerfully over backgammon. My solitude did not sting the way it once had. Instead, it wrapped around me like a cloak, giving me space to breathe. I thought of Laura's face when she told me I was too old. The clipped tone of her voice, the way she smiled without warmth. The memory no longer crushed me. It fueled me. For every moment she had diminished me, I would take one step here, eat one bite of this bread, breathe in one breath of this air, and make it mine. Evening began to fall, the light softening against the stone shadows stretching long across the alleys. I returned to my small hotel room, cheeks flushed from the sun and the steady walking. I set the postcard on the desk ready for morning and slipped off my shoes with a sigh. When I reached for my phone, I saw the screen lit up with a new message. Laura. The words sat stark against the glass. Have you watered the plants yet? The air in the room seemed to pause. For a heartbeat, old habit pulled at me, the urge to respond quickly, to reassure, to serve. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then I pressed the side button and watched the screen go dark. My chest rose with something like laughter, though no sound escaped. For the first time, I let a demand pass unanswered, and the silence that followed felt better than any reply I could have given. I set the phone face down on the table and opened the window wide. The night air swept in, carrying the sounds of the city, and I lay back on the narrow bed. Outside, Athens moved on without me needing to do anything for it. Inside, I felt a freedom that was beginning to take root, small but steady, and I let my eyes close with the comfort of knowing that I had no one to answer to but myself. I woke the next day with sunlight pressing through the thin curtains and the sound of scooters echoing off the narrow streets. My legs still ached from the climb through Anaphiotica, but I welcomed the soreness. It was proof that I had walked where I wanted, not where I was told. I pulled on my shoes, wrapped the navy scarf loosely around my shoulders, and decided I would return to the cafe near the square. I wanted to sit again with my thoughts, but life had a different plan for me. The cafe was already buzzing when I arrived. The tables were so close together you could almost borrow sugar without asking. I found a corner seat, ordered coffee, and let myself sink into the background. I had barely spread butter on my bread when a voice broke through the murmur. You use too much butter. I looked up. The woman sitting across from me had silver hair swept into a precise bun, glasses perched low on her nose, and an expression that held both sharpness and humor. Better than too little, I answered, raising an eyebrow. Her lips curved in a smile that hinted at approval. Fair point. She introduced herself as Rosalie Dubois, 71, retired principal from Boston. She had arrived in Athens 2 days earlier, traveling alone because her children insisted she would not enjoy it. I laughed, though there was little humor in it. My son and his wife told me I was too old. They left me home to watch the house. Rosalie leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly. Too old. That phrase again. People like us seem to hear it more often than our own names. Her words settled into me like a stone tossed into still water. I felt the ripple spread recognition sparking between us. We spoke for hours. She told me about her years running a high school, how she was called strict, but secretly admired the students who challenged her. I told her about my years as a nurse, about the long shifts and the faces of patients who had no one else. When I mentioned Paul, my husband, she nodded with understanding and admitted she had been widowed a decade ago. Neither of us lingered on grief. We carried it the way older women often do, not as a wound, but as a quiet companion. When the plates were cleared and the cafe had emptied, Rosalie leaned closer. "I am heading to Florence next. You should come." The suggestion startled me. I had only just begun to believe in Athens. Florence felt like a mountain, yet something inside me stirred. "Why not?" I heard myself say. Her smile widened. "Then it is settled." We walked through the winding streets together that afternoon, noticing small details that others ignored. She pointed out a broken shutter painted lilac. I noticed the stray dog sleeping like a statue. I shared something rare and comforting. With Rosalie, I did not need to explain myself. That evening, back in my hotel, I began folding my clothes into the suitcase. The thought of Florence carried both weight and lightness. My phone buzzed on the desk, jolting me. I hesitated before reaching for it. David's name filled the screen. "Mom, we are at the airport. The tickets are invalid. What happened?" Another message followed quickly. "Did you cancel them?" "All 4. Do you realize what you've done?" My chest tightened, but not with fear. The vibration of the phone, the urgency in his words, all of it felt like proof that I had shifted something. They were facing the disruption, not me. The phone rang again. Laura this time. Her words came fast, angry. "How could you? Do you know how much money this cost? The kids are crying." I let the sound fade into the room, steadying my breath. My whole life I had answered quickly softened blows, made excuses for others. Not this time. I placed the phone face down in the drawer and closed it firmly. For a moment I sat very still. The room seemed to hum with silence, the kind that is not empty but full. I thought of Paul's photo back in Portland, the smile that had once told me I could be more than what others demanded. I thought of Amelia, 16, and searching for her own voice. What would she see if she knew her grandmother had quietly reclaimed hers? I walked to the mirror and adjusted the scarf around my shoulders. My reflection looked different, alive, with color from the sun eyes sharper than they had been in years. I whispered the word Florence, tasting it like a promise. The next morning, Rosalie and I met at the train office. She carried a folded map under her arm, and I carried my small suitcase. We bought our tickets together, 2 older women among the bustle of younger travelers. The clerk smiled at us politely, but I caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. Rosalie noticed too. "Let him wonder," she murmured as we stepped aside. I laughed softly, feeling strength rise in me. That night in my room, I packed carefully, rolling my scarf and placing it on top. I left the phone in the drawer turned off and silenced. Outside, Athens buzzed with evening life, but inside I felt calm. For the first time, I was not waiting for permission. I was moving forward. The last sound I heard before sleep was Rosalie's voice echoing in my memory. "Too old." That phrase again. People like us hear it more often than our own names. I smiled in the darkness because tomorrow Florence would learn my name. The train ride into Florence felt like entering another world. The landscape outside shifted from olive groves to soft golden fields stitched with vineyards, each stretch of land more beautiful than the last. Rosalie sat across from me reading a French mystery novel, her glasses sliding low on her nose, while I stared out the window with my hands folded tight in my lap. The countryside reminded me of an old painting Paul once loved, one he had bought from a flea market in Portland for $10. He used to say it looked like a place he had never been but always wanted to see. Now, decades later, I was here, and he was not. When we arrived, Florence welcomed us with warm air and narrow streets that smelled faintly of leather and bread. The hotel Rosalie had chosen was small and old, its elevator creaking as we climbed the key's heavy brass with worn leather fobs. Our room overlooked a courtyard where laundry lines hung between buildings like flags of daily life. I opened the shutters and breathed in deeply. I was really here. The next morning, we made our way to the Uffizi Gallery. Even before we stepped inside, I could feel the weight of history pressing down as though the walls themselves were whispering. The rooms were crowded with tourists' voices echoing against the high ceilings, but the art pulled me forward away from the noise. When I stood in front of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, I froze. The pale figure emerging from the sea, her hair flowing her body, delicate yet unashamed, struck something deep inside me. For years I had moved quietly, apologizing for taking up space, for aging, for being in the way. But here was beauty born, fully grown, standing tall against the tide. My throat tightened. I realized I was crying, though no sound came. Rosalie touched my elbow lightly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I nodded, unable to speak. For a moment it felt as though I had stepped into the painting myself, emerging from years of silence into something new. Later, we wandered past Michelangelo's David, his form towering and strong, carved with impossible precision. Rosalie made a joke about how even stone could look more confident than some men she had known. I laughed, and the sound surprised me. It felt free, unguarded, like a note I had forgotten I could still play. That afternoon, after hours of walking through galleries and piazzas, Rosalie pulled me into a boutique. "You need to try something new," she insisted, her voice firm but playful. I protested weakly, but she was already holding up a dress soft linen in a shade of blue brighter than my scarf. I stepped into the fitting room and hesitated before the mirror. The woman staring back was not the same one who had stood on her porch in Portland watching her family drive away. My shoulders were straighter, my eyes clearer. I tied the belt at my waist and smoothed the fabric. It fit. When I stepped out, Rosalie clapped her hands once. "There she is," she said, and I blushed like a girl. We left the shop with the dress wrapped in tissue. I carried the bag like something fragile and precious, not because of the fabric, but because of what it meant. That evening, we sat at a small cafe on the Oltrarno side of the river, far from the crowded squares. The air was cool, filled with the smell of sage and butter from the kitchen. A waiter brought us pasta and a carafe of red wine. Rosalie teased the young man into smiling, and I found myself laughing again, the sound easier now. As we ate, my phone buzzed against the table. I ignored it at first, but the vibration came again, then again, until finally I turned it over. Dozens of messages filled the screen. Laura's words leapt out at me. "You made us look ridiculous. Everyone in the neighborhood knows we had to cancel our trip. People are talking. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" More messages followed the tone, shifting from anger to accusation. "You have embarrassed us. The children are upset. How could you do this?" I read them slowly, sipping my wine between each one. The anger that once might have sent me scrambling to defend myself now only rolled off me like water from stone. The humiliation was theirs, not mine. Rosalie watched me carefully. Bad news. I slipped the phone back into my bag. Nothing I cannot handle. The night grew darker, the city alive with soft music, and the sound of voices drifting through the streets. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the day settling into me, and let the noise of Florence wrap around me. For the first time, the messages from home felt distant, like static from a radio I no longer needed to hear. I walked back to the hotel with Rosalie, my new dress pressed gently against my side in its bag, my heart steady in a way I had not known in years. When I closed the shutters and set the bag carefully on the chair, I knew one thing with certainty. Their anger no longer owned me. My life did. When we arrived in Lisbon, the air felt heavier, salted from the sea, and alive with the sound of trams grinding along narrow rails. Rosalie and I checked into a small guest house painted pale blue, its shutters flaking its stairway steep. Our room overlooked a square where children kicked a ball between rusted benches. I leaned on the balcony rail, breathing in the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting up from a vendor below. Rosalie was quiet that evening, her color a little off, her movements slower than usual. By morning, she admitted she was running a low fever. It is nothing, she said, waving me away. I have been worse. But I could see the fatigue in her face, the way she winced when she sat down on the bed. Without thinking, my old instincts surfaced. I fetched cool water, placed a damp cloth across her forehead, and brewed tea from the dried herbs I had bought at a corner market. She rolled her eyes but smiled when I tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "You are fussing," she teased. "I know," I replied, adjusting the cloth gently. "But this time, I want to." It struck me as the hours passed that caring for her did not feel like the years I had spent caring out of duty. This was different. I chose it. I sat beside her reading aloud from a book we had picked up in Florence and listened to her breathing steady as she drifted into sleep. The sunlight shifted across the tiled wall, and for once I felt peace in giving instead of being taken for granted. By evening, Rosalie was stronger. She sat propped on pillows, sipping the broth I had managed to cook with tomatoes, eggs, and bread from a vendor downstairs. She lifted the spoon, nodded once, and said it was the best thing she had eaten in weeks. I laughed, though it was only a simple meal. Later that night, once Rosalie was resting, I wandered alone through the winding streets of Lisbon. The sidewalks shimmered faintly from an earlier rain, the cobblestones slick under my shoes. I followed the sound of music until I found a small bar tucked between two laundry-strewn alleys. Inside, there were no tourists, only locals gathered at wooden tables with glasses of dark wine. A woman stood to sing. Her voice was deep, cracked in places, but it carried through the room with a force that silenced every whisper. The music was fado. I realized the melancholy sound of longing and survival. She sang of being left behind, of being told to stay quiet, of finding strength in loneliness. Tears pricked my eyes before I could stop them. The words were Portuguese, but I understood all the same. She was singing my story. I pressed a napkin to my eyes, let the sound fill me, and for the first time since Portland, I felt myself breaking open in a way that healed rather than hurt. When I returned to the guest house close to midnight, Rosalie was awake, her eyes alert in the dim lamplight. "Did you hear music?" she asked softly. "Yes," I said, and it told me something I needed to hear. I slept deeply that night, my body finally releasing a weight it had carried for years. Morning brought fresh air through the balcony doors and a sense that the city itself was nudging me forward. But when I opened the door to fetch bread from the hall, I nearly stumbled over a folded piece of paper pushed beneath it. My name was scrawled across the front in David's handwriting. I carried it inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and unfolded it slowly. "Mom," it read, "we don't understand what you are doing. The kids are confused. Amelia cried last night. We thought you were just upset, but this feels like punishment. If you are trying to make a point, you have. Please come home." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done. Only fear, only their discomfort written out like a list of grievances. Rosalie saw the letter in my hands but said nothing. She simply poured me tea, the steam curling in the morning light. I folded the paper into thirds, slid it into my purse, and closed the clasp. My hands were steady. I am not going back, I thought. Not yet. Not until I return as someone who will never again be dismissed. Outside church bells rang over the rooftops, their sound cutting through the square. I lifted my scarf, straightened my shoulders, and turned away from the letter waiting in my bag. Lisbon still had more to teach me, and I was not ready to be silenced. When the train rolled into Seville, the late afternoon sun burned the rooftops gold, and the air seemed to vibrate with heat. The moment I stepped down onto the platform, I felt the weight of the city press against me, heavy and alive. The scent of oranges drifted through the streets, mingling with the faint tang of dust and stone. Rosalie fanned herself with a folded guidebook and muttered that Seville was determined to cook us both, but I only smiled. Something in me welcomed the fire. Our hotel was tucked between a bakery and a small shoe shop, its modest lobby cool with tiled floors and the faint smell of lemon polish. From the balcony of our room, we could see a courtyard planted with orange trees, their blossoms sharp and sweet in the evening air. Rosalie tossed her hat onto the chair, declared she would not move until the sun set, and poured herself a glass of water. I, however, could not sit still. That night, we followed the rhythm of clapping hands into a small courtyard theater where locals had gathered for flamenco. The chairs were crowded close the stage, nothing more than a wooden platform, but when the dancer appeared, the space transformed. She was a woman well into her 70s, her silver hair pulled tight, her body sturdy but unshaken. The room held its breath as her heels struck the boards with such force that I felt it in my ribs. Her arms sliced the air, her voice joined the guitar in a low cry, and she became something greater than flesh. I could not look away. She was not asking for approval, not offering apology. She was claiming the stage with every stomp of her foot. For a moment I felt as if she danced for me, showing me what it meant to live unashamed, to take up space in a world eager to shrink women like us. My eyes burned and I let the tears fall freely. Rosalie leaned over and whispered, "She is older than we are. Look at her." I nodded, unable to answer, my throat too tight. When the performance ended, the crowd roared with applause. The dancer bowed, once her chest heaving, then slipped quietly into the shadows. I clapped until my palms stung, wishing I had the courage to thank her. Later that night, Rosalie insisted we stop at a tavern she had heard about. The place was dim, the tables sticky with old wine, the floor worn smooth by countless feet. A guitarist sat near the door strumming sharp chords, while a small crowd clapped in rhythm. The air was thick with smoke and laughter, alive with something unpolished and real. "Come on," Rosalie said, her eyes glinting. I shook my head, heat rising in my cheeks. I had not danced in years, not since Paul was alive. Even then it had been cautious, careful. Weddings, birthdays, the smallest sway of hips while everyone else spun freely. My feet had learned silence. But then the music swelled, the clapping quickened, and something broke open inside me. I stood my knees trembling, my hands shaking, but I stepped onto the floor. At first I moved stiffly, my arms unsure, my feet heavy. Then the beat found me, and the years fell away like dust from old cloth. I lifted my arms, stamped my feet, and felt laughter bubble up from somewhere long buried. A young man caught my eye, smiled without mockery, and offered his hand. I took it, spun once, laughed aloud, and let go, determined to carry the rhythm myself. Rosalie soon joined me, her earrings flashing in the dim light, her movements unpracticed but full of joy. We danced like women starved for freedom, our bodies awkward yet fearless. The crowd clapped harder, cheering us on, and for once I did not care how I looked. I only cared that I was moving. By the time we collapsed back into our chairs, my hair clung damp to my forehead and my chest ached from breathless laughter. I had not felt that alive in decades. Rosalie raised her glass in a silent toast, and I lifted mine to meet it. Back at the hotel, I peeled off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, still humming the rhythm of the guitar. The night was thick and quiet, broken only by the hum of a ceiling fan. When my phone buzzed on the nightstand, I considered leaving it untouched, afraid it might pierce the fragile glow I carried. But curiosity won. The screen showed a voice message from Amelia. My thumb hovered before pressing play. "Grandma, I just wanted to say I understand." Her voice began soft and a little shaky. "I see what you are doing and I am proud of you. I do not want to live being controlled either. I do not want to be told I am too young or too silly or too much. You showed me there is another way." Her words cracked something inside me. I pressed the phone against my chest, tears sliding hot down my cheeks. My granddaughter, only 16, had seen what so many refused to see. She had looked at me, truly looked, and found courage in my defiance. I played the message again and then a third time, letting her voice wash over me. Each word stitched itself into my heart, sewing together the broken places that David's cold letters had left. For years I had lived as if unseen, fading into the corners of family gatherings, answering only when asked, filling spaces no one else wanted. But Amelia's voice pulled me back into the light. When I finally set the phone down, my pillow was damp with tears, but my body felt strangely light. The dancer's fire still echoed in my bones. Amelia's pride wrapped around it like a song. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the city outside, and knew that for the first time in decades, I was no longer just surviving. I was alive. The morning light in Granada was softer than I expected, filtering through lace curtains and pale streaks that painted the tiled floor. I opened the balcony doors and stepped out, breathing in the cool mountain air that carried with it the faint smell of orange blossoms. From where I stood, I could see the outline of the Alhambra high on the hill, its walls glowing faintly pink in the sunrise. Rosalie stirred behind me, groaning that it was too early, but I was already restless, the weight of Amelia's voice still echoing in my chest. Later that day, we made our way up the steep road to the Alhambra. The climb was long, lined with whitewashed houses whose walls were draped with bright bougainvillea. When we entered the palace grounds, the world seemed to shift. Every wall, every arch, every ceiling carried patterns so intricate they looked impossible. Arabic verses spiraled upward, carved into stone hundreds of years before I was born, and I traced them lightly with my fingertips. In the court of the lions, I stood still watching the water trickle from the mouths of marble lions. The sound was soft yet steady, and it reminded me of the quiet drip of IV lines in hospital rooms long ago. I thought of Paul lying in one of those beds, of how small I had felt sitting beside him, powerless as the machines hummed. I thought of all the years afterward when silence became my companion, and of the times I swallowed my words when Laura dismissed me with a laugh. We wandered into the gardens where cypress trees lined stone paths and roses bloomed in neat beds. I found a bench in the shade and pulled out my leather journal. For days I had been carrying it, jotting down notes here and there, but now the words poured out as though a dam had broken. Things I never said. The humiliation of being told I was too old. The sting of watching David stand silent while Laura took the lead in every decision. The loneliness of dinners where my voice was ignored. The anger at myself for letting it happen. The deep ache of wanting to be more than useful, to be valued for who I am, not just for what I do. My handwriting grew messy as the sentences rushed forward. I filled one page, then another, until my wrist cramped. By the time I paused, 4 pages were heavy with ink, and I had written more honesty in one sitting than I had spoken aloud in years. I closed the book gently, my chest lighter, though my eyes stung. Rosalie returned with 2 small cups of coffee, her eyes sharp as she looked at me. "Writing your secrets," she teased. "My truths," I corrected. She nodded and handed me the cup without another word. That evening after dinner in a small tavern where we ate lamb stewed with almonds, I sat by the window of our guest house. The city sparkled beneath us, narrow streets alive with music, voices rising and fading like waves. My phone buzzed on the table. I almost ignored it, bracing myself for Laura's fury, but the message was from Amelia. Her words froze me. "Grandma, Dad doesn't know what to do. He walks around the house looking lost. Mom is angry all the time. She keeps saying you need to sign papers so they can manage everything. She says it is irresponsible for you to hold on to the house and money. I think they want you to give them control. I am scared." I read the message 3 times, each line pressing harder against my ribs. It was no longer about a canceled trip or embarrassment. Laura wanted my independence stripped away. The house Paul and I had built a life in, the savings I had guarded carefully for emergencies, the last pieces of security I could truly call mine. She wanted them all. Amelia's fear cut deeper than Laura's words. She was old enough to see the truth, young enough to still believe it could be changed. I pictured her sitting in her room, phone in hand, writing to me in secret. She had chosen me, trusted me. My hand shook as I set the phone down. I wanted to call her, to tell her not to worry, to promise her that no one would take from me what I was not willing to give. Instead, I opened my journal again, turned to a fresh page, and wrote in bold strokes, "They cannot take what I will not surrender." The ink smudged as my hand pressed hard, but the words felt like armor. I closed the book and held it against my chest. Rosalie entered quietly, carrying a pot of chamomile tea. She noticed my expression and raised an eyebrow. "Bad news?" she asked softly. "Only reminders," I said. She poured the tea into 2 cups, set one in front of me, and didn't press further. That silence was her gift, one I was grateful for. I sipped slowly, the warmth calming my hands. Outside, guitar music floated up from the plaza. I let the sound carry me back to the image of the Alhambra's walls, standing firm through centuries of storms and sieges. I thought of how they had endured, not because they were untouched, but because they had been tested. I whispered into the quiet of the room, more to myself than anyone else. "So will I." The lights of Granada flickered in the distance as the night deepened. For the first time, I felt not only the weight of the battle ahead, but also the strength to fight it. When the plane touched down in Portland, the gray skies felt heavier than the Mediterranean sun I had left behind. Yet stepping back onto American soil carried its own weight of certainty. I rolled my suitcase through the familiar airport halls, my scarf still tucked neatly in my bag, my heart steady in a way it had not been months earlier. Outside, Carol's old station wagon waited at the curb. She waved me over her face, half hidden by oversized sunglasses, though the day was cloudy. The drive through my neighborhood was quiet until Carol finally spoke. "You know, people have been talking." She glanced sideways, her tone both gossipy and protective. "Some say you vanished to teach your daughter-in-law a lesson." I smiled faintly, not confirming or denying. Let them think what they like. The truth was more complicated and also simpler. I had taken back what was mine. When we pulled up to my house, the garden looked alive despite weeks of neglect, the roses stretching wild, the grass a little long. I stepped out of the car and breathed in the damp Oregon air, different from Spain, different from Greece, but still mine. Carol helped me with my suitcase and whispered, "You look taller somehow. Stronger." I thanked her, though I knew what she was really seeing was not my posture, but the shift inside me. It did not take long for David and Laura to arrive. I had barely set my suitcase down in the hallway when the sound of tires crunched over the driveway. Their SUV door slammed, heavy footsteps marched up my porch, and then Laura's voice rang out before David could even knock. "So this is what you have been doing. Running away, making us look like fools." I opened the door calmly. Laura's face was flushed, her eyes sharp. David stood behind her, wringing his hands, avoiding my gaze. They stepped inside without waiting for me to invite them. Laura dropped her purse onto the table like she owned the place. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Canceling those tickets, vanishing without a word, leaving us to explain. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" I met her stare. Humiliating for you, perhaps. Freeing for me. David shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, maybe we can just talk." Laura cut him off, pulling out a stack of papers from her bag. "We need you to sign these. Power of attorney. It will make things easier for everyone. You cannot keep managing all this on your own." My chest tightened, but I did not falter. I looked at the papers spread across my dining table, the same table where Paul and I once hosted holiday dinners, where Amelia colored with crayons, where I sat alone after everyone left. Laura's voice kept droning on about responsibility, about safety, about avoiding chaos. I lifted my hand and the words came clearer than I expected. "Stop. I will not sign anything." Laura blinked as if she had misheard. "What do you mean you will not?" I stepped closer, my voice steady. "I am not a shadow in this family. I am not here to be managed or dismissed. If you want me in your lives, then you will treat me as a whole person, not as a housekeeper, not as a signature on a piece of paper." David finally raised his eyes, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. I walked to the sideboard and opened the drawer where I had tucked away a single sheet during my packing in Lisbon. Slowly, I laid it flat on the table between us. It was the airline confirmation stamped with the word "canceled" in bold black letters. Their eyes flicked down to it, confusion crossing David's face, fury burning in Laura's. I placed my hand on the page. This was the moment I turned the tables. "You thought I would sit quietly, accept what you decided for me, but I will not." Laura's mouth opened to protest, but I raised my hand again. "Enough." The room went silent except for the sound of the old clock ticking on the wall. I could feel my heart pounding, but it was not fear. It was strength steady and earned. For years I had swallowed words until they turned bitter inside me. Now I let them spill not as an outburst, but as truth. David finally spoke his voice low. "Mom, we did not mean to make you feel this way. You did, I said, and now you will remember it." Laura's face twisted, but she said nothing more. She gathered the papers, sharply stuffed them back into her purse, and marched to the door. David lingered a moment longer, eyes downcast, before following her out. I stood alone in the quiet of my living room. The canceled tickets still lay on the table, their edges curling slightly. I pressed my hand against them one last time, then folded the page carefully and slipped it back into the drawer. Through the window, I could see Carol watering her front garden, pretending not to watch, though I knew she would share the story before the evening ended. Let them talk, I thought. The tale they would tell was not of an old woman being controlled, but of one who had taken her place at the head of her own table. The house was mine. The life was mine. And for the first time in years, the silence that settled around me was not loneliness. It was power. The house was quiet the next morning, only the steady tick of the clock in the hallway breaking the silence. I had just finished watering the roses in the backyard when I heard a knock at the front door. When I opened it, Amelia stood there clutching a worn canvas tote. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes shining with something both nervous and determined. "Grandma, can I come in?" she asked softly. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. She sat at the dining table where only last night Laura and David had confronted me. From her bag, she pulled out a small spiral notebook decorated with doodles on the cover. She slid it across the table toward me. "I have been writing," she said. "Not like homework writing, more like things I do not want to inherit." I opened the notebook carefully. On the first page in her looping handwriting, she had written things I refuse to carry. Underneath, she had listed silence, blind obedience, pretending to be small. My chest tightened as I read. I lifted my eyes to hers. "Amelia, this is brave." She looked down at her hands. "Dad wants me to study business. Mom says it is practical, but I do not want that. I want to go to New York and study art. I know they will say it is silly, but I cannot live my whole life doing what they want." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked younger than 16. I reached across the table and held her hand. "You do not have to be what they expect. You can build your own life just like I am doing now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "You showed me it is possible. When you left, when you traveled, when you said no to them. I saw you fight and it made me realize I could too." We talked for hours. She told me about the sketches she had hidden under her bed, the hours she spent copying photographs into charcoal, the way her heart beat faster when she thought of galleries and museums. I told her about the nights in Athens and Florence, about the flamenco dancer in Seville who moved like fire, about standing before the birth of Venus and feeling born again. Her eyes widened as she listened, drinking in every word. At one point she whispered, "Grandma, I do not want to be afraid anymore." "You will not be," I answered. "Not if you keep choosing yourself." When she finally left, the notebook stayed behind in my hands. I placed it gently on the table beside the folded airline confirmation, 2 artifacts from 2 different generations, each marking a choice to be free. That evening, as the light dimmed and the house grew still again, I found an envelope pushed through the mail slot. My name was written on the front in David's careful handwriting. I sat down before opening it, my hands suddenly unsteady. Mom, the letter began. "I do not expect forgiveness right away. I know I failed to defend you and I let silence do the talking for me. I am ashamed of that. I want to learn how to see you as more than the role I boxed you into. I want to understand you as a person, not just as my mother." The words blurred as I read. He had not said sorry outright, but in his own halting way, he was reaching across the distance. I pressed the paper flat against the table and closed my eyes. The ache in my chest softened. The anger I had carried for so long shifted slightly, leaving space for something else, something quieter. I was not ready to forget. But perhaps I could allow the first fragile step toward change. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into the notebook Amelia had left, and closed the cover. For the first time in years, I felt a bridge rising between generations, fragile but real, built not from silence, but from words finely spoken. The house creaked as the night settled in, but instead of loneliness, I felt the faint hum of possibility. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, a scent that once meant comfort, but now carried a layer of tension. I had set the table myself, placing 4 plates neatly with matching glasses, something I had not done in years. When the doorbell rang, I smoothed the front of my blouse and opened the door to see David, Laura, and Amelia standing together. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then I stepped back, letting them in. The dining room felt smaller with all of us there. We sat down, each of us stiff, moving carefully, as though one wrong word might shatter the fragile evening. I noticed how Amelia chose the seat beside me, her hand brushing mine under the table. Laura sat across, her lips pressed tight, David between us with his shoulders hunched. We passed food in silence at first. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked, but no conversation filled the air. Finally, Laura cleared her throat, her eyes darting toward me, then away. "I suppose I should apologize," she said. "Things got out of hand." Her tone was clipped, her words hollow, and for once I did not rush to soften them. I did not tell her it was fine, or that I understood, or that she had done her best. I simply nodded once and let the silence hold her accountable. David shifted in his seat. "Mom, we cannot change what has already happened, but maybe we can start again." Before I could respond, Amelia reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook she had shown me days earlier. She opened to the page marked with a ribbon and began to read. "These are the things I do not want to inherit," she said, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger. "Silence. Obedience without question. The idea that love means giving up everything you are. I want to live honestly. I want to speak even when it is uncomfortable. I do not want to disappear." Her words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise. I felt the sting of tears, but kept my hands steady on the table. Laura looked down at her plate, her jaw tight. David looked at Amelia with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Then David turned his gaze to me. His lips pressed together, and slowly he nodded. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. He was acknowledging me, acknowledging her, acknowledging the shift that had already begun. The rest of the meal passed quietly. There was no sudden reconciliation, no dramatic embrace. But the air felt different. The balance had changed. Later, after they left, the house settled back into silence. I cleared the table slowly, washed the dishes, and then sat down with my journal. The pages smelled faintly of ink and leather, and the weight of it in my hands was grounding. I began to write. I am not abandoned. I turned the tables, and I will never again ask permission to live. I closed the journal and set it beside Amelia's notebook on the shelf. 2 generations, 2 voices refusing silence. The clock ticked in the hallway steady and sure. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet surround me, not as loneliness, but as freedom. If this story has touched you, share it, so other women know they are never too old to begin again.